Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. This is the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we try to dismantle shame through education, stories, and mental health tips and strategies, whatever we can to dismantle shame. And with me today, I've got one of my providers from Symmetry Solutions, Jenny Elledge, who's from Orlando, Florida. And
Hello.
yeah, hi, Jenny. So glad to have you. She's also licensed here in Utah and does a lot of great work for Symmetry Solutions in couples work, sexuality work, faith transition work. It's kind of the main things that we specialize in. And today we are going to discuss kind of some of the topics of the day, right? We're trying to do this kind of on a monthly basis, kind of look at what's been happening both within kind of the faith community we both come from, which is the LatterDay Saint / Mormon kind of community, but also in general, kind of what's happening in the world and this intersection of religion and mental health and sexuality, which is always kind of a fascinating space to kind of keep your tabs on. So I'm going to start off by kind of giving you time to talk about something that happened kind of in your local region through the Mormon church. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the fireside that was planned and that happened and that you attended?
Yeah, for sure. So, if you're outside of Utah, sometimes you get these firesides that happen once in a while where, someone from, Utah, I think they're from Utah, will come and speak about a topic at your local stake. And this is kind of done privately. It's not, I don't think it's done out of service. Like there's no money being exchanged necessarily. So it happened once in a great while. So recently I saw
I will say that a lot of times there is money exchanged. Like they will bring out people, like I know that's happened with like Fight the New Drug and things like that, where they actually charge quite a bit of money to bring in these things to local congregations. But I don't know if that's the case with this particular one, but I just want to say that sometimes money is part of the deal.
That does happen. I think I read a letter. I think the state president was getting some pushback around this topic that I'll tell you about in a minute. And in response, did say that they didn't pay for them to come out. I think they were mutual friends of someone in the state, and that's why they came out. Yeah, so the topic, let me read to you the actual advertisement. It was called Embracing Your LGBTQ Loved One and Your Faith. So it's kind of a faith promoting fireside about what to do when one of your loved one comes out somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. So I went there because I was curious. I've been in this area for 15 years now. I don't recall seeing a topic like this before being addressed in a public way. So I wanted to go out and see. And also I got personally invited to go out and see as well too. So I said, let's do it. So my husband and I went to the fireside at the local stake building. This is by the way, who came out, Scott and Becky McIntosh. And on the blurb, you can see a little QR code where you can see their story. So they have had already things on the internet, and I think on the church's website about like a video they did around the topic already that they're referring to. And really what they're doing throughout the whole fireside is sharing a story, which is always very interesting, right? For anyone listening to someone else's story to say, yeah, tell me what you went through. I'm kind of curious about that. And I would say that they did a fairly good job. They did a good job. They were, their approach, I really appreciated their transparency. They were pretty transparent in the difficulties they had, particularly in the beginning, where their older, some more adult, emerging adult age son came to them and told them that he was gay. And their first initial response was, well, we need to fix this. We need to, take you to the doctor. We need to have your hormone levels checked. We need ... And the son was very gently pushing back on all of that. It's like, no, that's not what I need. I'm just letting you know this is part of my identity. And I think they were pretty transparent about how heartbreaking they thought all of that was. They had to adjust, right, to their dream, what they imagined was going to happen. I think he's one of maybe 7 children, so a big family. And I don't remember where he was in the lineup of the children, if this was the oldest, middle, or youngest. But yeah, so, and they were pretty transparent about, well, okay, we have to make some adjustments here. They mentioned one pivotal moment for them was when the son told the mom, I've read everything that you have sent my way. I've read every talk, every quote, every scripture around this idea that I should, kind of stick this out. I can still be faithful, I can do this, but you haven't read the book that I sent to you, which was by Carol Lynn Pearson. And I don't know which book it was exactly. They didn't really mention the title in the book. And she was like, yeah, you're right. I haven't read it. And I get to own up to that. So she read it, and that was helpful for her to switch her thinking from this is terrible, this is awful, to how do I embrace, how do I love my child? That was kind of the takeaway message. That was her focus. And she took probably
the two books that Carolyn Pearson has written around these topics one is Goodbye, I Love You, which is kind of a memoir of her own experience in a mixed orientation marriage. And then her husband ended up dying of complications due to HIV/AIDS. So how kind of they ended up getting a divorce, but then he also came back during the end of his life, and she became his caretaker. So that's kind of that kind of mixed orientation kind of story that's very common in our culture. And then the other one that she wrote is called No More Goodbyes, which is more, I think, for kind of the public, right? The LDS public, as far as some of the issues and the importance of, I think the subtitle is Circling the Wagons around, our gay members of the church, and how harmful it can be if we're not affirming and accepting. So I'm guessing it was one of the 2 books that
probably
center.
Yeah, she didn't really call the title out in her own presentation. So yeah, so probably one of those 2 sounds like a fitting message. Becky took like maybe an hour to go through all of this. I think they played a couple of clips. You can look them up and see their clips somewhere. They had one that was specifically made through the church, and then they had their own where they did their own kind of family coming out story on her blog, where she said, we need to love was basically the message that they kind of came out with as a family. And so all a very positive, love affirming, relationship oriented type of message. And then the time went over to Scott, the husband or the dad. And he kind of was a little bit more pointed to the men in the audience. And he said, you can't hide behind your wives doing all the work here. You also, as dad, need to show up. You need to show up in very much more emotionally available ways to your child, so that they know they're not being excluded. And he said he had a hard time with that. And he called himself out. He said, I was angry a lot, and I withdrew. I was a bit too punishing. I used language that was not helpful, until my son called me out on it. And he said, Dad, what you're doing is not helping our relationship. And he kind of had a humbling moment and said, yeah, you're right. I need to do better. And he kind of advised other men in his speaking audience to take inventory about how they're showing up in their relationships, and that being punishing or using harsh, language with other people is not going to help your relationship. Another thing that I remember that stood out to me is they did not just, they talked mainly about the gay part of the LGBTQ spectrum, but they did point out transgender care and did call out the same message. We need to love and embrace all of these people so they feel included. Now, the faith promoting part came through presenting a couple of quotes from church leaders and from what's the website that they have? The Mormon Gay, do you know what it's called?
I'll look it up. I think it used
Yeah.
to be mormonsandgays.com, but I'll make sure that
Yeah.
we're doing that accurately.
We'll find out what that is and let you know. But yeah, they use a lot of language from that website. Basically, the updated version now is, we no longer, as a church, no longer promote getting married to someone of your opposite attraction. We don't promote that anymore. I think they used a quote from Elder Oaks that said, we haven't done that practice in decades, to which I was like, well, I don't know about that. I'm not sure.
So I'm going to just put in a little thing. So I'm aware just through his social media, David Archuleta, he's kind of like a singer, popular figure, right? Kind of coming from Mormon background. He was very upfront that just recently, just in the last 2 years, I think, somewhere, I forget the timeline, he had a meeting with an apostle of the church who did still say, we can find you a girl to marry. So there's a lot of these mixed messages, right? So where they'll say, oh no, we haven't done that for years. And yet somebody goes in with one of the top leaders of the church who is still basically encouraging a gay man to marry a straight female partner.
Right. So that's the messaging that's being kind of, you can probably, I felt like the quotes were a little bit cherry picked. You can find all kinds of affirming messages, but there's also ones that are not affirming, and situations that are still actually happening outside of what they think they're promoting right now. Plus, also, these are members of a church. This is not top leadership sharing this, right? This is not like being broadcast to the entire church population, which is maybe my kind of critique. I appreciate their efforts as a member to relate to other members, but systemically, I'm still seeing an issue that we don't have from top-down leadership saying this is what we're doing. It's being done a little bit online, through this, but these one-on-one personal relationships, like this David talking to an apostle, or I imagine a stake president talking to a member, or a bishop talking to a member, they're probably saying different things that are problematic.
Yes, very problematic. So going back to the question about the website, so it now has all been rebranded, especially since the church has been having such a campaign against using the word Mormon. The original website was mormonandgay.lds.org, but when you push that, it redirects you to churchofjesuschrist.org/topics/gay. And when you go onto the page, the first thing that it has is not anything about LGBT or gay or, any of the words that the LGBTQ community would prefer. Immediately, the first title is same-sex attraction. Same-sex attraction, kindness, inclusion, and respect for all of God's children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the same-sex attraction language is that exclusive to the LDS Church? I don't know that I've heard that outside of the LDS Church.
It's not exclusive. It's not exclusive. And, sometimes it's used kind of in a clinical way because we're trying to say, okay, who are you attracted to? So are you attracted to same sex or opposite sex? However, it is very well known to be used within evangelical circles, LDS circles, kind of high demand or conservative religious circles as a way to denigrate the title of gay. Because as you know, not that long ago, a few years ago, again, one of our primary leaders, the apostle David Bednar, said there are no homosexuals in the church. Do not identify yourself as gay. So same-sex attraction denotes this idea that you're dealing with a struggle, with a trial, with an aspect of life, like it's a temptation. Whereas if you say I'm gay or I'm lesbian or I'm bisexual, now we're talking about identity, right? And we're talking about how people perceive themselves and experience life, right? So, and these, of course, are aspects of, even in our country, protected forms of identity. You can't discriminate due to things, race, culture, ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ status, etc. So it is a very, very intentional way to, dismiss anybody's identity. This is just something you're struggling with.
Right. Yeah. I'm bringing out that language on purpose because if we are going to be loving and inclusive about LGBTQ friends and family members, then we really need to use the language that they use. And most people who are out do not use same-sex attraction language. So if you want to be very loving and very inclusive, then ask, how do you identify yourself? Do you identify as queer? Do you identify as gay? Do you identify as bisexual? And they may or may not want to tell you, depending on your relationship to them. They're not obligated to, but ask, so that you are using language about how they identify themselves.
Yes.
Same thing with pronoun.
Yes. So it sounds like what you're saying is this couple was very transparent. They're still members of the church themselves.
Yes.
So, and this is kind of a typical pattern, right? That the church, of course, will use certain families or certain individuals who kind of fall under the LGBTQ umbrella, even families and friends and things like that. And as long as they're kind of following a certain path that's still, considered gospel worthy or gospel centric, then they'll be offered these opportunities to either present or be on the website. And yet then the minute, right, because I've heard from a lot of people who have been kind of on that, circuit, right, that if they shift to actually having a relationship with, within a gay or lesbian or bisexual relationship, whether they, of course, leave the church or change some of their ideas around their interpretation of gospel doctrine, then the church will, of course, delete those videos, delete those people, and get kind of the new crop of people who are trying to live in a way that the church approves, right? And which, of course, kind of offers this ongoing perception, especially to people who aren't necessarily as aware, aren't living kind of in these kinds of situations, that see, people make it work. And if you're gay or lesbian or queer or trans, you should do what the current people on the website are doing, which is somehow living a life that is in accordance with gospel teachings and how the church wants you to obey and comply. Which isn't very realistic, because not a lot of people stay on that website for very long, is I guess my point. And then what you're saying too is that this couple in particular has been able to do some self-determination work, it sounds like, right? They're able to say, okay, here's the messages that we hear from the church. It wasn't, again, that long ago that another apostle, President Oakes, said, if you have a gay or lesbian child and they're bringing their partners to your homes, do not really allow that, right? Do not let them sleep in your home. Do not treat them like you would, obviously, a married heterosexual child of yours. So there are very specific ways that, or quotes, and very recent quotes, that obviously this couple did not share at this fireside. Kind of like what you're saying. They're kind of cherry picking the positive quotes, because there are positive quotes as well, especially quotes that have to do with being loving. And of course, I think, how do we define being loving is a whole nother discussion we could have, because I know I have a queer child, and, I just did a podcast on mistakes I made as a parent with them. And, things that I thought were loving, or things that the church had taught me were loving, surely did not come across as loving, right, to my kiddo. And so kind of to your earlier point, how are they receiving love? What are they needing to feel loved? And I think sometimes the idea of being loving is that, well, I just won't make any rude comments to you about you being gay or lesbian, or I will still, quote unquote, be willing to be in presence with you, like go out to lunch with you or things like that. Or, and some people can take that even to more kind of harmful ways of being loving, which is I'm going to proselytize to you, or I'm going to try to convert you or try to get you to see the light, because that's the only way that you can, quote unquote, reach salvation. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes, to your point, that was a quote that I thought of with President Oak when they shared a more positive quote with President Oak on the screen. I'm like, yeah, he said that, but he also said some other things. Yeah, he has also said some other problematic things. Like, yeah, so is it loving to say, I love you, but your partner, we're not going to mention their name at all. We're not going to ask about what your life is like, what's up with you and your partner, and then not include them in family events. That's not really very loving if you're treating the relationship as a sort of invisible thing, right? You still get to ask, you still get to be curious if you want to be relationship oriented. So I would say loving means not just sort of this general acceptance, but like lean into the relationship centric questions and connection, which is you are interested in all the parts of their life, not just only the one that you are okay with.
Right. And that you're really managing your own anxiety around.
Exactly.
So,
which is an honest and real thing, but be aware of that. Be aware of what's coming up for you as you're managing.
Yeah.
This. That's okay. I mean, it's okay.
Yeah. And there's tons of kind of, religious parents who don't attend LGBTQIA weddings, who don't support gender identity, just a lot of things.
One thing I will mention, this was advertised as a multi-stake fireside. I don't know how well the other stakes actually got the marketing, because I don't know how many other stakes actually attended, but I think 3 were invited. But I recognize mainly where the stake building, whatever stake that is, were mostly in attendance, and I would say about 100 people showed up.
Okay. So for a multi-stake event, it really wasn't that well attended. Less than a ward showed up.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
I think there were and I think I saw a few, maybe a handful of youth there, but mostly for adults too.
Right.
Mostly adults.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's also Sunday night, and it's also, at the end of a long Sunday day.
Right.
Active believing members. It's also travel. You have to travel, 20, 30 minutes to get there from wherever you might be living. It is a bit of an ask, to attend.
Was it offered through
No live stream, just in person only, from what I could tell. I'm pretty sure though. Yeah. So
okay.
I mean, overall a nice, good message, but yeah, if I were to offer a critique, and I would love the same message to be just being talked about at a general conference talk. I would love for the prophet to be sharing this directly at length.
Yes. And I think this is one of the critiques of that's just out there, right? Is how do you do a middle way? There's going to be people that will say, well, if you're part of the church at all, then you're kind of complicit with a system that discriminates against LGBTQ plus members. And then of course there's the people who are totally in, who are like, we're not discriminating, we're being loving, and we're just following the gospel. It's not our fault, this is God's fault. And then there's all these people, which I think there's more and more kind of in the middle, like, okay, I value my religion, I value my community, I value my faith tradition, and I see problems, right? Whether they're problems for LGBTQ members, whether they're issues with feminism, whether they're issues with historical data, and can we address these issues? And the reality is that most organizations don't necessarily experience change top down. It's usually grassroots movements, social right movements have always been kind of more grassroots. And then once enough of the grassroots kind of energy is going, then eventually it gets to either legal or political or religious leaders kind of attention, and then that's how change happens. So I see both sides of that. I see the side that, I don't want to be complicit with a bigoted organization that damages maybe my child or damages me. So I'm out of here. And then of course I see the aspect too of the people who want to stay and hopefully make change from within. And and of course that takes decades and it's hard, and there's a lot of harm that's happening within that time frame. So it's very complex. It's just this is kind of how communities function.
Yeah, that's a good call out to how change in big organized systems actually do work. I think we often have, and maybe I just express sort of a hopeful wish, right? I wish, right, that this is coming from top down. I think it would probably help this message to be given. Plus, I want the leaders to be accountable. Like, pick a lane. Don't keep saying contradictory statements. Like, say what you mean what you say. That would be really helpful in any organization leadership to be very clear about what the message is. And usually if you have to change the message, like if this is a different message that's being given, 20, 30 years ago, so you need to call that out. That's part of the transparency. It's like, we did it the old way. Calling yourself out is to recognize, you can't just say, oh, this is the way it was done 20 years ago. Like, you have to say, we as a church collectively did some harm. We didn't do things very well. I mean, we would love that to happen in the Mormon religion. It doesn't happen that well.
Yeah, and there was a talk just at the recent General Conference address just a few weeks ago. I forget who gave the talk, but he kind of alluded to this, right? That you should pay attention more to current prophets and leaders versus older prophets and leaders who maybe said things that, were things of the time. That talk drew a lot of controversy as well, because again, even though I do think there's truth to that, one, that's not a general message we get, right? So it kind of leaves the membership in this kind of confusing space, right? Like, who are we supposed to be listening to, and how do we justify some of these beliefs that we have, that are actually causing harm, and that we have actually research to show that, and it's not a mess. And then even to your point, which I totally agree with, and it's my opinion that church leaders have zero excuse, top church leaders have zero excuse for not being trauma informed, for not being LGBTQ plus informed, with the billions of dollars and resources and people who would be willing to train and help and organize movements, and the pulpits that they have and the microphones that they have and the opportunities that they have to reach a very wide audience. There is zero excuse for the, literally, I think, the blood on their hands of so many of people that we lose to suicide, and just not even people who we lose to suicide, but just people who are living really difficult, challenging, discriminated against lives. Some of the research that's coming out of the University of Utah right now that I've been involved with Lisa Diamond shows that ostracization from your church community is very detrimental to mental health wellness, right? So that was one factor that they actually included this time. So that it's real, and these things have real life effects, which kind of gets us to our next topic of the day, because here you had this experience listening to this couple who was so inclusive and kind of open and progressive, darest we say liberal, in their approach to their gay son, who they have decided they need to take an affirming, position with. And right as all of that is happening, one of the leaders of our church, David Glenn Hatch, is giving a very different address at BYU Hawaii, where we get quite a different agenda, and darest I say even propaganda that is very much geared in some direct and indirect ways, specifically targeted to the LGBTQIA plus population. So maybe we can read some of this, which is hard for me. But his,
do you know that he's actually a leader, or is he just sort of, because if I click on his bio, he seemed to be like an international concert and recording artist, but is he an actual, like, does he have a leadership position? Do you know?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know what his current calling is per se in the church. However, you have to be somewhat in a leadership position, I would imagine, to give an address at a college university, religious college university.
Yeah.
There are very few opportunities, and usually it's somebody within the area authorities or general leadership that are given those kind of speaking assignments. Yeah, I'm not, but that's maybe something we can look into, is exactly what calling he has. So he's talking a lot about identity. He's talking about personal value, which again, those things are not necessarily bad things to be talking about. One of the things that he says that I actually agree with, is like, we shouldn't really let people tell us whether we are good enough, attractive enough, rich enough, famous enough, or desirable enough. So, he's talking about the fact that we all have immense worth. And great. Okay. So that's an example of a good quote, right? Like, good quote. And then he goes right into this fairly long paragraph, and I'd kind of like to probably read most of it, but he says, we must be aware of the great destroyer who is working daily to destroy our self-concept. The destroyer is the great deceiver. We're talking about Satan, the ultimate lying liar who will stop at nothing to separate us from God. So this has been a complaint I've had for a long time about kind of a style, a cadence in the talks from leadership, is that they use kind of fairly provocative language, very fear-based language. This language is meant to kind of rise anxiety and, angst. And he's definitely doing this. His tactics have not evolved much since the garden, but he's certainly adept at staying ahead of the curve. The great deceiver's specialty is his keen interest in your feelings, your opinions, and personal preferences. Preferences is an interesting word choice there, because when we talk about a lot of sexual things, we're talking about sexual preferences. So right off the bat, you're kind of listening to a message where your own feelings, your own opinions, and your own preferences, so drives, desires, etc., are not to be trusted, right? Not to be trusted. And this is where I think high demand religions and the field of mental health really go, kind of in contraindicated ways. I mean, I think that we as mental health professionals recognize that obviously there's feelings that are not always trustworthy. Like if you're clinically depressed, you are going to have a lot of feelings and or thoughts. If you have OCD, you're going to have a lot of feelings and or thoughts that are not necessarily useful. And they're not even accurate about yourself, right? Like, I'm a loser, I'm not worthwhile, life would, people would be better off without me. These are kinds of thoughts and feelings that we as mental health practitioners are challenging and helping people challenge and have more positive reframes of how they see themselves. However, that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about feelings such as, I think I might be attracted to somebody of the same sex or gender. Or, I have a feeling that some of these things that this person who is speaking for God is saying don't resonate with me. Or, I have a thought or opinion that maybe some of the stories that I've been taught as a youth around my religious background aren't really historically accurate, right? These are the things that he's referring to. And then he goes on to use language that is very, very interestingly chosen. So he says Satan is quite progressive that way, right? So where in the world do we use the term progressive? And wants to hear all about it. Your concerns are his concerns. and he knows exactly which rendition of Jesus is pertinent to your cause. It is likely to be a socially relevant liberal Jesus who somehow cares more about your truth than the truth he came to personify, proclaim, and die for. Really, really interesting propaganda here as far as first of all, who gets to decide what Jesus stands for, right? Because of course we've got 500,000 religions that have different ideas about what Jesus has to say. But and it's also interesting, since Jesus was pretty liberal and socially relevant for his time, given some of the messages that he was offering. And a lot of the messages that he was offering were to religious leaders, kind of like this man himself, that were saying, you're not really paying attention to the marginalized. You're not really paying attention to, people who aren't fitting your ideas of what's religiously correct. I mean, the irony of all of this being missed is always very interesting to me.
Yes.
But this is really one of the things that I think is just mentally harmful, and this is maybe a thought not only for Satan, but even for God himself or herself, or however you think of God, is that we have this sense that there are these entities out there, and I say even a boogeyman for Satan, right, who have access to our brains and to our hearts and feelings. That if you're a believer in these kinds of personages, you do not have any sort of privacy. And then he goes on to say that, the deceiver dishes out a new gospel, and then he whispers to us, that's much better. So when you have a thought in your head, you, if you're a believer, are kind of in this space, and I remember being in this space of having to think, is this thought a whispering from the Holy Ghost, who has the right to tell me things? Or is this thought a temptation or idea from Satan, who also has a right to be in my brain, in my own brain? And I'm just curious as to whether or not people have really considered what kind of effect that may have and being able to try to figure out what is going to be best for you, right, in your life. Then he goes on to say, to be clear, he won't tell you to give up your faith in Jesus. That would be that'd be too easy to be like, oh yeah, that's Satan telling me that. But that obviously some of his outdated theology needs revamping because it no longer works today, which that's really interesting, because aren't we the church of ongoing revelation? I mean, we actually have this belief baked into our gospel teachings, right? And there has been outdated theology, and, they've had to really face a lot of the outdated theology, which was horrific when it came to race and, issues of even some of our outdated theology about women. So it's just interesting. When do we get to decide these are okay things or not okay things?
And what things are currently being taught that will in the future be considered to be outdated? Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I think this is why they don't want us to think that things could be outdated, because it doesn't take that much more logic to think, well, what could be outdated 10 years from now that they're currently saying right now, right? A good chunk of it is offensive enough to be considered a hate crime. So again, he has never once said LGBT, but he is using all the language around the LGBTQ plus quote unquote agenda, that they are so afraid of. And especially that bit about marriage and sexuality. And I have been very public in sharing that, yes, a lot of the teachings and quotes that are currently being spouted from the LDS pulpits are serious enough, discriminatory enough that they qualify for hate speech. So that's what he's referring to, right? And so he just kind of continues to, I'm not going to continue to read all of this, but he knows how to place deceit in our hearts and is well acquainted with our carnal desire to rule and worship ourselves. This is all very Calvinistic, right? So I don't know if people understand the history of the natural man, but that was Calvin and had a huge impact on current Christianity. This idea that you cannot trust your own desires, your own body, your own rights for pleasure. All of that is very hedonistic. And so we've adopted, as a more modern church, a lot of these older Calvinistic approaches to religion. So simply put, Satan wants to destroy people. He wants to thwart God's kingdom purposes and plans. He wants to hurt the people God created and loves. He wants to wreak havoc by discouraging, disarming, and derailing us. He wants to confuse people and lead them away from the truth of who God is. He wants to kill and destroy the soul of every man, woman, and child. Wow. I don't know.
Yeah. Yikes.
Walking away from that talk is very edifying.
No. Oh, okay. Okay, so think this is at BYU Hawaii, right? So who is in the audience? The emerging adulthood, who are very much developmentally on task if they are learning about their feelings, learning about their opinion, learning about their personal preferences, right? That is supposed to be happening. And in fact, if that does not happen, you are going to have some long-term consequences if you're not able to, and later in life, you might have to come back and revisit the area of development if you don't actually achieve it. It's actually very important for you to do that. It's interesting that this language, I have a couple of trains of thoughts that I'm going to cover, but just to kind of close that loop where he says, he's quite progressive that way and wants to hear all about it. Your concerns are his concerns. And I'm like, this is what I tell couples to do all the time. As a couple, if you want to be relationally connected to each other, you got to be curious. You got to ask questions. You got to say, here's what I think. What do you think? You got to be inquisitive of people's preferences, opinions, and definitely their feelings. That's interesting. So yeah, does that mean that Satan's like a part of that process?
Satan's doing some relational work with us, I guess.
That is interesting.
Yeah, it's high, and I completely second your concerns around developmental just markers, right, that we see as normative and appropriate, and that if we arrest developmental stages of life, we're only harming people. And it was, I think it was Alan, one of our other providers in today's meeting, who said, well, what's the alternative here then? So what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to ignore all of your preferences? Are you supposed to not trust your feelings and opinions? Are you supposed to, like, what is, it sounds like the alternative here is, and you can't even follow your own version of Jesus, I guess, right? So I guess, so even if you're following Jesus, are you following the right version of Jesus? So I guess really the alternative really what is being very clearly said, you as an individual, you have to follow the current prophets and leaders of the church, who I guess are the only ones who can trust their preferences and their opinions and their feelings, because supposedly they've got, I guess, a better connection to the real Jesus and the real God, which is not progressive and not liberal. And that's how we should live our lives.
Yeah. So that then, okay, so you're supposed to be then like obedient. Obedience is the most highly valued value that you can have. And so therefore the leaders are the only ones that you can trust. And if there's a difference between what you feel and what they feel, then you just squash your own feelings and just obey the leadership, which I guess benefits the leaders. I don't know how much that benefits personal development, growth, and self-determination, all things that we know are part of, good mental health and relationship health.
And spiritual health and sexual health. Right? Because how are you really supposed to develop your own spirituality even if all you're doing is following in the steps of another person's idea of what is spiritually relevant to them? And it goes against really basic gospel teachings, which is to find your own light, to, have your own agency. So many things that you can find, again, if, depending on which chapter of the gospel you're cherry picking from, you can find different ideas about whether or not you should be more leaning towards obedience or more leaning towards your own personal revelation and, trusting your own kind of quote unquote spiritual discernment. And so it doesn't make room for different diversities in spiritual discernment, right? This is one of the biggest dangers and why it really ends up spiritually harming people's relationships if they're going to have a relationship or a belief in a God or in something kind of supernatural. Those are really difficult things to develop if all you're doing is following in somebody else's footsteps.
Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, ethically, probably as therapists, we can see all the issues here. Like, you can't talk to people like this. You can't determine, like, my life according to Jenny Elledge. I can't project that onto other people's lives. That would not be ethically sound. So if you're hearing someone else speak to it, it's something that we can easily see. However, at the same time, I did listen to Mormon Stories podcast on this. And I did learn and they got feedback, but they got the feedback from the people who attended. So they were able to share that. And that was the part that was interesting, that you don't see just by reading the talk, but how did the audience respond to this? And I guess the background story is this is a campus that just recently had a completed suicide by one of their students, just like maybe a week and a half prior to this address being given. So everyone is, of course, sad and mourning in some way, and then they come to a devotional hoping for an uplifting talk, I would imagine, and get this message instead, and are kind of walking away going, shaking the head. I think on Mormon Stories, they highlighted quite a few comments about people just like a little bit aghast that they got this message. Like, I walked out of there feeling horrible. I feel so bad about myself. Ugh.
Yeah, right. And then the title of it being called The Value of a Soul, which maybe this person was thinking this would be helpful. Like, we're going to help you feel more value about yourself so that you don't feel suicidal. Again, this shows complete ignorance in mental health issues. It shows complete ignorance in trauma-informed or suicide-informed types of addresses. And if you're once again, because it seems like it's very difficult to find an address from an LDS leader these days that does not somehow focus at least one sentence or paragraph or the entire topic on making sure that gay, lesbian, trans, queer people know that they are not on the right path, that increases the risk of suicide, that increases the risk of mental health symptoms, that increases the risk of negative coping skills, such as substance abuse or, a variety of other things, overworking, those kinds of things. So it's just, I don't know what it's going to take for church leadership to get on board with health and wellness in regards to our members who are, and like you're saying, emerging adults. Some of these emerging adults will have listened to this and taken it very much to heart and will internalize it in ways that we're very worried about. Other emerging adults are so beyond this. Like that's, I think, what's being not understood as well, is that so many people are informed about basic mental health, wellness, trauma, suicide, social justice, it's not even really progressive anymore. It's just kind of like the norm, some of these things. And so when they hear these disconnecting messages, they're not really doing service to the retainment of people who will find these kinds of messages just completely just not relevant. Why are you going to go to church where the messages are not only harmful, but just irrelevant to your life? Like, they just don't make sense anymore. So I don't know what's going to take, but these are very concerning things. Anything else you want to say about this before we move on?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so on a positive note, the state of North Dakota, because we've been having a lot of negative notes on what states are doing these days, especially conservative states, but North Dakota, which I believe falls under the red states, continued to veto the issue that came up where they were trying to have it so that educators in North Dakota would not be able to use preferred pronouns in school systems. So that was vetoed, and that veto stands. So transgender pronouns are still able to be used in accordance to a person's preference and identity, and in ways that are affirming to who they are as a person. So that is a win.
All right. Go North Dakota.
Go North Dakota.
Shout out to North Dakota. Good job.
Yes. So that was good. Another thing that we wanted to kind of briefly talk about, just a few days ago, Ethics and Psychology published a paper, or I guess they actually published probably a republishment of a study that was done in 2021 called The Relationship Between Compulsive Sexual Behavior, Religiosity, and Moral Disapproval, by Jennings, Ling, and more. And it was originally, I guess, published in the Journal of Behavioral Addictions. So this continues to just find what we have been hearing for, like probably about a decade now, that compulsive sexual behavior is associated with religiosity and moral disapproval for sexual behaviors, and that religiosity and moral disapproval are often used interchangeably in understanding moral incongruence. So that's kind of an interesting thing that they're trying to distinguish, with religiosity being defined as, how religious you are, and moral disapproval being more how you feel about your own behavior. So for example, like a good example is this couple in Florida. They're obviously still very religious, right? So their religiosity may be measured high, but their moral disapproval of their gay son is low, right? Whereas, so those are kind of two different things. And they're saying that the studies haven't necessarily accounted for these two things being different. So the present study expands prior research by examining relationships between several religious orientations and compulsive sexual behavior, and testing how moral disapproval contributes to that relationship. So the results indicated that if your beliefs were rigid and the adherence to those beliefs were rigid, that would up the moral incongruence, and it would predict greater compulsive sexual behavior, which is what we've been saying for a long time. So this idea that guilt and shame, especially around, and usually what they're talking about with compulsive sexual behavior is usually pornography usage. That's not always the case, because there are obviously other behaviors, but that's a big focus in a lot of these religious communities, is kind of problematic pornographic use, and whether or not people see their use as problematic. So the more problematic, the more immoral you think something is, guess what? That rises your anxiety, that rises the costs, that rises the angst, not only for the individual, but usually for the individual and their relationships. And all of that usually does not help compulsive behavior decrease. So
yeah. I'm glad that they have these studies still happening.
Yes, I think that what we learn from that is that whether or not you have values that would include whether or not you want to have sexual media be part of your life, taking more accepting approaches, taking approaches where you have realistic expectations, where you have education around why we as humans, most of us are very curious and are drawn to sexual content, that those would be more effective ways of maybe lessening unwanted compulsive sexual behavior, instead of these approaches which are very shaming, kind of the addictions approach, or the approaches that have to do with like abstinence only, zero sum types of ideas and goals to have, zero behavior. Those usually increase the shame and guilt, because that's not how usually human behavior works. Usually human behavior is that we can lessen unwanted traits of ourselves, but that doesn't mean that they disappear completely. Even something as simple as anger management, right? Or I think of all the things I'm trying to work on in my life. I'm still working on them. They're not things that just have disappeared. I have made progress, I feel better about myself in many areas of my life. At the same time, they're not just done and gone and never having to be addressed again. So,
do you be able to share with the audience what the difference is between out of control sexual behavior and what is maybe collectively as a society we say sex addiction or porn addiction?
yeah, so I mean, I've done a lot of podcasts on this for anybody who's interested, do deeper dives. These are all very confusing language, and they're also very confusing as to whether or not you meet the criteria because as usual, human stories and experiences get in the way. So if you read the criteria for compulsive sexual behavior, you could have somebody who, maybe has spent $50,000 and has spent, like 5 hours a day and has, on whatever, on compulsive sexual behavior, who is maybe has lost their job or has, lost their marriage due to, just kind of something being so compulsive and kind of overtaking your life. And this can happen with any behavior, right? So any behavior can get out of balance in your life, and it can be part of kind of a compulsive diagnosis, which means that you have, for whatever reasons, issues with impulse control. A lot of times compulsions are reactions to obsessions that you have. So obsessive thinking, it's kind of part of OCD type diagnoses, etc. So if you read the criteria for compulsive sexuality and you have that kind of an experience, you would be like, oh, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. At the same time, knowing how the story is in a conservative religious background, you could take a young person who maybe is preparing for like a mission or something like that. They maybe masturbate once a month or once every 6 months. They have some quote unquote impure thoughts, and they would read the same criteria and go, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. Because sexual drive, of course, like hunger or sleep or most human functions, sexual drive functions on a repetitive program, however that shows up for you. So you're going to be faced with your sexual drive on a repetitive way, unless you really orient as asexual or something like that, where you may not have as much drive or interest in that direction. So there's a lot of problems with knowing who is diagnosing these things. How is it being diagnosed? Is it being self-diagnosed? Is it being diagnosed by a professional who comes from religious bias themselves? Is it diagnosed by a professional who has sexuality training? And what are the parameters of sexual health, and who gets to decide what is compulsive behavior? Like how many times, how many hours, how many activities, and what's the distress level of the individual, right? And of course we know that, and this is kind of what this moral incongruity is talking about, is that you can have high levels of distress for similar behavior or even less behavior than most people out there who do not have any distress because they masturbate once a day or they participate in consuming sexual media from time to time. So these are very complex things. And is it fair that somebody who comes from higher religiosity, more rigid religiosity, maybe more moral incongruence, is it fair then that they get labeled as sick or disordered because their level of distress is obviously much higher than somebody who doesn't share those same values? Very complex. It's all very messy. It's all very messy. And so I take all of these terms very, with a lot of critical thinking, critical view, try to educate people on these topics. And then the term addiction itself, so that's really an inappropriate term to be using at this point. We have enough science to know that our sexuality is not, responding the same way as our brain might respond to like dependence on a substance. Most of us, there's a lot of talk out there about behavioral addictions. One of the ones that are most prominent is gambling, which is similar, probably the most similar to thinking about a dependence model, mainly because there's an issue of satiety, right? So, even if you win, if you, I don't know, push the button and all the coins come out,
Ding, 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 ding.
doesn't necessarily mean that you are now satisfied. You collect your coins and you press the next button, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lot of time. That's what we mean by satiety. Usually, like with food, even people who maybe feel like they have an unhealthy relationship with food, there usually becomes a point where you become full enough or satiated enough that you do stop eating. So that's not necessarily the case with gambling. There's some ideas around like video gaming that could potentially fall under this category too, although it's still under review as far as whether or not it's going to be classified as a quote unquote disorder. So sexuality doesn't really show up that way. Once you have an orgasm, it's kind of like more in the eating category. Once you ejaculate or have an orgasm or climax, your body kind of goes into a natural stage of rest, and you're not interested again until the next time your sexual drive kicks in, which we know, of course, that can be artificially influenced by your own anxiety, right? So just like if I like even emotional eating, right? Like if I'm anxious or bored, a lot of times when people are thinking about nutrition and how to have healthier relationships with food, a lot of nutritionists will start helping you think about your emotions and how that relates. So a lot of times we're not eating because we're hungry. We're eating because I'm bored or I'm anxious, or, it's become a coping mechanism of some sort. And this is why a lot of behavioral folks like the word addiction. I hate it. I think it's a very diseased model. Once an addict, always an addict type of approach to something as normal as your sexuality. It's very harmful. And the associations that matter, that specialize in sexuality, especially ASECT, have come out and been very clear that this is not the model where we should be treating sexually unwanted behavior or compulsive behavior. That there are much better models to treat those kinds of things and through an addictive lens, because it doesn't really follow that anyway. And it's not helpful if yourself is sick sexually.
Yeah, that's not helpful.
That's a little bit of what
it's another complicated subject for sure. But yeah, when we're talking about out of control, sexual behavior, we're really focusing on how people feel about their own sexuality, like where the tensions are and where those messages are coming from. So if you typically have outsourced a lot of your sexuality to be through a very social lens, then that might work to a degree when you're younger and you're not quite fully developed and not quite in relationships yet. But when you start to be older and you're an adult and you're in relationship, it's going to be problematic to keep outsourcing your sexuality to what other people think you ought to do. And you have to claim your own sexuality to be yours for what works well for you. And that can be a journey for some people.
Yeah, for sure. Doug Braun-Harvey, he's the author with Michael Vigorito on treating out of control sexual behavior. I remember when that book came out, which is excellently done. I did talk to Doug about the title. I was like, I don't know that I love the title, right? Because, and what title can you really give this? Is it problematic sexual behavior? How are we going to define problems that come from value discrepancies or social expectations or our own mental health issues? Because sexuality, of course, is a very normal human behavior. And so it's going to be affected, and people are going to have a perspective of whether or not their sexuality is healthy or unhealthy. But I feel like, again, saying out of control sexual behavior gives credibility to a lot of people who come from high demand or conservative religions in ways that I don't think those are accurate ways to describe out of control sexual behavior. So he agreed that it's just hard to find language that can really be completely void of baggage or kind of certain segments of the population seeing it a certain way. But the whole book and the treatment approach is exactly what you said, Jenny, which is, you as the individual, do you feel out of control and why? Right? So somebody who comes in and says, I feel compulsive and I am visiting massage parlors, even though it goes against my values. I'm doing it daily. I don't want to be spending this money, and it feels compulsive. Like there's something compulsive about it. I can't really stop, and it's not in the contract with my spouse, and I'm being deceitful. So that that's kind of like, you can see, I don't necessarily think that there's a moral, I'm not going to come up with a moral reason or a moral, as a therapist, I should not be the one that says going to the massage parlor for a happy ending massage is morally correct or not correct. That is not my job. That is everybody's job to figure out what their morals are. And there are plenty of people that see, credible sex work as definitely fitting in within their morals and their values and their life situations. But for this particular presentation, that person may feel out of control. And so we'll come up with kind of treatment strategies and plans on how that person can be more attuned with their own behavior, their own emotions, their own stress, their own coping skills, etc. You may have a person who feels, like they're out of control because they masturbate every 3 months, right? And they're coming in and they're saying, I don't understand why, like, I can do so well at, abstaining from this behavior, but it seems like every 3 months or so I give in and I feel very out of control. So you can see how both people feel out of control. Feel out of control. They're distressed about their behavior. It may be causing relational issues. Even the person who's masturbating every 3 months, if they're going in and talking to their bishop and confessing about that, or maybe talking to a potential spouse or their own spouse about things like that, it could be causing a lot of distress due to their beliefs and their standards of how people should be showing up sexually. So it is challenging because both of those people would qualify for feeling out of control. So what we can do as mental health professionals is we can really do a lot of values assessment. We can do some psychoeducation, sexual education. We can offer kind of research and information around what may be helpful and what might be realistic expectations around a sexual life, what has worked or what hasn't worked, and why or why not, where are these messages coming from, like you said, what familial or cultural or religious messages have we kind of integrated and internalized that may or may not be causing some of that distress. So I'm known for saying there's a lot of unnecessary distress out there because of the stories that we tell. So life is hard enough. I think we don't have to cause artificial distress, which kind of goes back to this BYU Hawaii talk. I feel like there was a lot of artificial distress there that was being provoked. Life is hard enough without thinking, oh, there's somebody in my head who's whispering I'm being, too progressive or something like that. So,
or that you can't trust your own thoughts and feelings. Yikes, that's a problem. We have to learn how to trust our own thoughts and feelings. That's a marker for good mental health, for your own self-determination to shine through. I guess it's safe to say that we kind of disagree with this whole message, BYU Hawaii. Maybe there was a good thing in there, but mostly we see mental health implications here.
Yes. I'm not interested in. I mean, it's kind of like a book that I might recommend to a client. If 80% of it is crap and bad science, but there was 10% of it that I would agree with, I'm never going to recommend that book. There's a lot of
too much work.
There's too much good science and good research
exactly.
that there's plenty of things we can point to without trying to find these little things. However, if you are in the religious community and you're hearing a message like this, it's probably important to try to only pay attention to the messages that align with what we know about mental health science and things of that nature, because otherwise you are kind of in danger of having unnecessary distress.
Yeah, and what you can handle as an individual about the unnecessary distress will vary from person to person. So some people may be able to stay in the audience and listen to a message and be able to self-determine for themselves what's going to be useful or not. And other people might be like, nah, I'm tapped out. I can't listen to this. I need to leave. And that's, both are valid spaces to be in. The difference is knowing the thing about yourself. It's like, is this something that I can handle? And of course, you don't know what's about to happen until you're in the talk and you don't know what the person's about to say. But and you're like, well, how much longer are they going to keep talking about this negative thing? Okay, this is going on for a long time. Holy cow, yikes. And now my anxiety is rising and rising and rising. And now what do I do with this? So yeah, being able to do some aftercare around this and touching base with other people, getting feedback, listening to other people talk about it. There's been a lot of people talking about this talk, will help with all of that.
Yeah, and I think that, like you said, I think you had mentioned that several people did walk out of this talk. So
yeah,
that was
the feedback
mm-hmm.
on, when they kind of polled, Mormon Story kind of got the feedback, right? That they polled people and they said, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, highly problematic stuff.
Well, we talked about religion and we talk about sex. Well, what do you know? That's what we do around here. All in one conversation. That's our bread and butter around here.
I know. It's just such a poignant part of people's lives. It's so interesting. When I went into mental health, I didn't think that this would be my specialty per se, but as I've worked with my community primarily, these are the main themes that came up, and this intersection of mental health and your religious and faith ideas and spirituality and sexuality. Boy, it's just a trifecta of so many aspects of people's relationships and identity and experiences that it is what we specialize at here at Symmetry Solutions. And if you're needing help or resources, we're more than happy to help out in whatever ways we can. We have groups. We have, of course, individual and couples therapy. We have wellness coaching. We have resources just on our website as far as things that you can go read or books that we recommend. So yeah, check us out if these are themes that are resonating with you and that you're needing help with. And I love your invitation, Jenny, to pay attention to your own body and your own capacity that, even if you do value your church attendance, that there are talks and times when you can tell that your spirituality is being edified and that you're feeling, good and warm and whatever ways that you would describe that. And then there are other times when your heart is racing or you're feeling overwhelmed, and it's perfectly okay to learn how to take a break, learn how to get up and leave, learn how to journal, learn how to have conversations, like you mentioned, lots of things that you can do to help yourself in these spaces that are bordering or actual harmful to you. Thank you for listening, everybody. I know that it's been, we've definitely gone over about an hour. Thank you, Jenny, for your time today. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the report and for going with your husband to this fireside. So I'm glad you were able to come back and let us know how that went.
Sure.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our outside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Naughtisch geschehen so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Naughtisch geschehen so we can always go to the home